What does Meister Eckhart say about hell? You may have heard this quote from Jacob's Ladder. The only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that won't let go of your life, your memories, your attachments. They burn them all away, but they're not punishing you. They're freeing your soul. If you're frightened of dying and you're holding on, you'll see devils tearing your life away. If you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels freeing you from the earth. It's not bad, actually, but it's not Eckhart. Here's what Eckhart actually said in Sermon 5b. There's a question. What burns in hell? The masters usually say, what belongs to the will does. But I say truly that nothing burns in hell. Now consider this parable. Someone takes a burning coal and puts it in my hand. If I say that the coal burns my hand, I do it a great injustice. Yet if I properly spoke of what burns me, nothing does. For the coal has something in it that my hand does not. The nothing alone burns me. If my hand had everything in it that the coal had and could achieve, it would have fire's nature completely. If you then took all the fire that ever burned and spilled it on my hand, it could not hurt me. So that's a little bit different, and there's considerably more going on there. But despite what you may have heard, the bit from Jacob's Ladder is actually not bad. The only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that you won't let go of in your life. That's not terrible. Here's why. So Eckhart answers the question, what burns in hell, by saying the masters, talking about Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica, the masters usually say what belongs to the will does. In other words, what is specific to the will burns in hell. That's not bad. It's actually very subtle. It refers to what is individual about you. So what is specifically individual with respect to what moves you, your desires. And so recalling that the 7 deadly sins are sins of desire, so the desires are what burns and burns off of the individual in hell. So that's a very subtle and interesting comment. But Eckhart goes further, and he says nothing burns in hell. Now, the bit from the movie says the part of you that you won't let go of in life. Now, that may not seem very much like nothing, but let's dive into this a little bit and see what's going on. So, in the original Middle High German, the word for nothing is nicht. And so this is related to the modern German that sounds the same but spelled slightly different. And the translations, there are a couple different that are possible. We can either say nothing or we could say not, as in I do not see anything. So it's that same nicht. But Eckhart uses it in a slightly different and provocative way. And what he means by nothing is a Platonic nothing. And so I think it's important to translate it as nothing. And the history of this is interesting. So Edmund College translates it as nothing, as I did. Walsh and Blakeney both don't use that. They use nothing, but then they also use not later on. It's grammatically correct, but I think that's not quite what Eckhart is going for. Fox, unfortunately, I think, this sermon's been translated a lot. Fox, unfortunately, I think misses it. He asks whether hell burns, and I don't think that works with the Middle High German. Nothing is better, and here's why. So, for Plato, as you may recall, and this comes up in the Parmenides, and it's elaborated further elsewhere in Plato, nothing is evil. In other words, no thing. Something that has a lack of being is precisely what's evil. In other words, evil is defined as a distance from the good. It doesn't have any positive existence on its own, which means that there is no form of evil. And so evil, quite literally, in Plato's ontology, does not exist. Evil is what it means for something not to exist. And so insofar as something is at a distance from the good, from God, it doesn't exist. And so transplanting this directly into Christian theology, and especially for Eckhart, who is very, Neoplatonic and Platonic specifically here, this makes a lot of sense. So nothing is what burns in hell because nothing is what separates you from God. And we hear in Sermon 12, to be separated from God for an instant is to be separated from God for eternity. For to be separated from God is the pain of hell. Now, this is not an unusual sort of concept, but the idea that this separation is precisely what must be overcome so that you can effect a return to God. Now all of a sudden we're talking about Neoplatonic mysticism again. We're talking in terms of the Neoplatonist with the exitus and reditus. So if you recall, you have the one, and so you have undifferentiated divine unity, and then you have a exitus from that, an emanation from the one, and that's where you get all things. Then, as there is a return to the one, that is the reditus. And so this is what Eckhart is talking about. So we're trying to effect a return to the one by purifying the soul and getting rid of evil, getting rid of the lack of being, getting rid of the nothing. And so specifically then, nothing is what burns in hell, because of course nothing is what separates you from God. Now that may seem a little bit strange. It may seem a strange thing to say, a strange way to say it, but we have to go further here, because for Eckhart, and indeed going back to, the divine names and what God calls himself in Exodus 3:14, I am he who is. So if God is being itself, and being is what gives anything existence, again, very Platonic, then you can't have the being of the individual in hell as the individual. So it can't be that can't be what burns in hell, because that would mean that God burns in hell, and obviously we don't want to say that. So it can't be the being of something that burns in hell. It has to be the lack of being. It has to be that which is evil about it, that which is individual. Well, if it's that which is individual, this sounds awfully close to Aquinas. And so how is this different? So the masters usually say, what belongs to the will is what burns in hell. Well, what belongs to the will, we're specifically talking about the individual will, but not necessarily the individual soul and all that makes the individual. We're awfully close, though, and Aquinas is very good with this. And so it's a subtle distinction. It's subtler than you might think. But in fact, what Eckhart is talking about here, and I think this makes a good deal more sense when we think about the concept of detachment. And so for Eckhart, what burns in hell is anything that you are attached to. So anything that you are attached to creates that condition of nothing, because a bond creates a separation from God. In other words, an attachment to something creates a separation from God. And so detachment, Eckhart says, is the highest virtue. Well, of course it's going to be the highest virtue, because detachment is characteristic of shedding that which keeps you at a distance from God. And so it all makes sense. Everything comes full circle in that way. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit further. Now, elsewhere in Sermon 6 we read, "Those in hell are in everlasting pain, but they would not let go of their lives, neither the devils nor the souls, for their life is so noble, since it flows without any intermediary from God into the soul. God's being is my life." So if there were any ambiguity about this, being of the individual, being of anything, including the devils, so the being of absolutely everything is divine. So God is being itself. This is very, very straightforward. But the implication is that to be in hell, you still wouldn't let go of your life, because there is still a spark, still a hint of the divine there that you don't want to let go of. So we hear this again. So in Sermon 15, God and the humble man are one and not two, so completely united. If this man were in hell, God would have to come down to him in hell, and hell would have to be for him the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so what does this all mean, and what does this mean in terms of the way that people usually think about hell? So this is why the Jacob's Ladder quote is really not that bad and doesn't misrepresent Eckhart terribly, in the sense that for Eckhart, hell is not the normal conception of things as everlasting punishment for souls who have been, naughty in one way or the other, who have in some way transgressed against God. That's not the idea. It's for any kind of separation from God. And so what burns in hell is the separation from God. And so one can be separate from God here on earth. And Eckhart says, again, I let off with this, but you may not have noticed the significance of it. To be separated from God for an instant is to be separated from God for all eternity, which means that even here on earth, to be separated from God, that is the pain of hell. And so for Eckhart, hell is not necessarily this otherworldly, supernatural thing to be feared. As a matter of fact, Eckhart says God is not something that should be feared, because whatever it is that we fear, we flee from that thing. And you don't want to run from God. That's precisely what you don't want to do. And so God is precisely that which draws you in, and we have a natural draw, a natural desire for God to move up to the good, to move up to God. And so hell is something quite different for Eckhart. And this is to be understood, I think, in terms of dualism and in terms of the burning off of any possibility of distinction of things. So any way in which we can distinguish one thing from another is going to be the way that we are able to establish attachment and the way that we do not fully recognize ourselves as God qua being. So in being, in the ground of the soul, in the ground of being, we are divine. And so for Eckhart, hell is not really what we get in the popular conception of hell. It's more along the lines of, well, if you're not there yet, if you haven't achieved the unity with God in this life or afterwards, then you are experiencing the pain of hell. And so it's not necessarily this otherworldly thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be, well, you messed up once and so you're consigned to hell for all eternity. No, it's more along the lines of if you've not fully relinquished, in other words, if you've not affected the kenosis, the emptying of self, and the emptying of that which is individual and attached to all created things, then you haven't gotten there yet, you haven't achieved union with God, and in proportion to that, you are experiencing the pain of hell. Again, this is all very Platonic. It fully accords with Plato's great chain of being, insofar as evil is just a lack of being. And so what we are trying to do is get rid of the lack of being, burning off attachment to things, in just the same way that Socrates put it with respect to the kind of burning off of ignorance.